Giving honor to the nation's first people, the land, their culture, sacrifices, and all they have cherished, all they've taught us, and all that they have lost. As a resident of Long Beach, I extend thanks and appreciation to the Tongva Nation. W.E.B. Du Bois empowers us through his words. Beneath the veil lay right and wrong, vengeance and love, and sometimes throwing aside the veil, a soul of sweet beauty and truth stood revealed. Good afternoon from sunny Southern California, everybody. We've been looking forward to this day for quite some time, and we come to you with an overpowering sense of urgency for our subject matter of banning our babies, addressing the suspensions of Black children in early care and education. I am Keisha Champion, a part-time instructor at Long Beach City College and Orange Coast College in Costa Mesa, California. And I'm a co-lead for the Peach Equity and Anti-Racist Work Group. You will find the more information related to Peach in the chat. One of our friends is putting information in the chat for you right now. Feel free to click on that link to discover more about Peach. Like or follow us on our social media platforms and our website for our history, our goals, and our outcomes. Before we begin, we offer guidelines for processing information in this webinar and beyond. We ask that you listen to different perspectives, tolerate some discomfort. Remember that disequilibrium is part of growth and transformation. Keep in mind, many culturally and linguistically diverse children experience discomfort every day. And on behalf of children, we ask you to remain open. Thank you for joining us for this candid conversation. Some heartbreaking revelations, shared stories from the profession, and opportunities to evoke change. I would like to introduce to you my friend and colleague, LaTanya Hardy, for something important she'd like to share. And welcome again.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to say I'm excited to be here and excited to share this with you. I'm going to talk about a group. The Links Incorporated is an international not-for-profit corporation established in 1946 by founders Marguerite Roselle Hawkins and Sarah Strickland Scott. The membership consists of more than 16,000 professional women of color and 288 chapters located in 41 states, the District of Columbia, the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, and the United Kingdom. It is one of the nation's oldest and largest volunteer service organizations of extraordinary women who are committed to enriching, sustaining, and ensuring the culture and economic survival of African Americans and other persons of African descent. The San Fernando Valley chapter of the Links Incorporated in beautiful Southern California. The president is Sonia Vaughn. The San Fernando chapter of the Links will be giving away 30 copies of the book, We Be Loving Black Children by Dr. Gloria Boutte and colleagues. Please use the QR code attached to the slide titled Black History Month if you would like to be in the prize giveaway for one of the free books. Thank you.
We will now hear from our San Diego State University team. Thank you so much.
All right, everyone, thank you for joining us so much. And I'm going to go ahead and share screen and talk about some of the work that we've been doing focused on Black children in early learning and really looking at some of the data that's become available through the state to really have an understanding of what's taking place. My name is Luke Wood, for those who don't know, and I am on faculty at San Diego State and also proud to be part of a collective of scholars who focus on issues facing Black students in education, and in this particular conversation, really looking closely at early childhood education. And I'll be presenting for a few moments here with my colleague, Mohammed Khas. We have been part of an effort called Black Minds Matter that many of you may be aware of for several years, which has really served to try to elevate the attention about issues facing Black students in education. And we really began our efforts to draw parallels between what we saw in policing and what we've continued to see in schooling. In policing, for example, we know that Black minds are undervalued and they're overcriminalized, or Black lives are undervalued and overcriminalized. And we've seen that through the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Ahmaud Arbery, and many others. And in our work, what we've really tried to do is to show the parallels between what is happening in policing and in education, recognizing that Black lives and Black minds are undervalued and overcriminalized. It all began really several years ago with a report that we co-authored with Dr. Tyrone Howard, who was just elected president of AERA, great to see. And that report was called Get Out. And what it really did was try to provide a framework for understanding the overrepresentation of Black students, particularly Black males, in terms of suspensions in California public schools. And what we have learned from that report and the series of reports that have followed is that when we're talking about the highest suspension rates in the state, they are for Black males, followed very closely by Native American males. And when we're talking about the highest expulsion rates in the state, they are Native American males, followed very closely by Black males, which really serves to illustrate and demonstrate the importance of the national focus on BI, POC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, recognizing that there is a unique experience that faces Black and Indigenous people in this nation. And we also know that those from other communities of color, particularly the Latinx community, also face many challenges when it comes to overexposure to exclusionary discipline. Within the K12 education pipeline, we know that there are a whole host of issues that serve to create challenges for our students. We know that there's an overrepresentation and misplacement of Black students into special education, particularly in categories such as emotionally and behaviorally disturbed, and that educators, when they look at them through both the lens of learning and through the lens of discipline, oftentimes will pathologize Black children as a way of making sense for their inadequacies in serving them. The other part of this is the inequitable discipline that takes place in terms of suspensions and expulsions. And you put those two things together, one pillar, overrepresentation in special education, the second pillar, inequitable school discipline, and those two serve as the pathways into the school to prison pipeline. We know that there's an underrepresentation of teachers who look like the students that they're teaching, that Black students are much less likely to be represented in honors programs, advanced placement, gifted and talented education. And all of it oftentimes comes down to deficit perspectives. It's much easier to see outcome disparities and to blame students, blame their families, and blame their communities, rather than taking the onus and responsibility of addressing these issues upon ourselves. Often what we have done is we have highlighted these issues through what is called the D3 effect: distrust, disdain, and disregard. Distrust refers to assumptions of criminality where Black students are assumed to be dangerous, deviant, up to no good. And you're going to see some really clear narratives from both research and some professional development videos from doctors Dejanette and Essien talking about what these patterns look like. In addition, we know that Black students are oftentimes viewed through a lens of disdain, where they are pathologized, where we make broad sweeping statements about them. They're lazy, they don't care, they're not really here for school, they have parents who aren't engaged, they come from communities that are bad. And these statements are meant to externalize it. And what we really want to encourage people to think about today is the we statements. What are we doing or not doing that is resulting in the outcome disparities that we see? And then the last area is disregard, where we have to recognize that there is an ascription of intelligence that assumes that Black children are academically inferior in comparison to their peers. And so we want to recognize that the combination of these three things, distrust, disdain, and disregard, creates a deleterious experience for our Black children. And so we want to meet distrust, disdain, and disregard by instead extolling the brilliance, dignity, and morality of our Black students. Part of that encompasses us having a real conversation about what the data look like across the state of California and across the nation. We're using 2018-19 data because the most recent 2 years of data are deeply affected by COVID, but the proportional overrepresentation of Black children, even within that data, has remained the same. What you can see is that essentially the statewide rate of suspension for K3 is less than 1%, as it should be, at 0.9%. But if you look at this chart here, you can see that the highest bar is for those who are African-American children at 3.5%. So 3.5 out of every 100 children in the earliest levels of schooling are being suspended. And you can see, as I mentioned, in terms of patterns, that's followed very closely by Native American children. But when we start to disaggregate by gender, this is where we start to really illuminate the patterns that are concerning. And you can see that on this screen, the highest bar is for those who are Black male students. That's 5.6%. Think about that. A 5.6% suspension rate in kindergarten through third grade. It's these kind of data that have served as a clarion call for many educators and for ourselves, respectively, in Black Minds Matter Coalition and in Peach, to really try to address these issues, recognizing that exclusionary discipline in the earliest levels of schooling is not a good thing. It hurts children, it hurts their families. It has an impact on how they think about school. Is school a place for me, or is school a place of hostility? Can I be loved here? Can I be embraced here? Or is this a place that I want to be as far away from as possible? When we start to disaggregate further, this is all K3 data. And we can look at, what if we look at Black students and the overall average for the state, disaggregated by boys and girls, the data for non-binary students is not as high at this level of education, so we don't have that data to report. But what you can see is that when you talk about students with disabilities, low-income students, foster youth, those who are homeless, that there even tends to be even higher overrepresentation. But what stands out to me as being a person who was a former foster child in K3 education in this state is that 14.3%. That's 14.3% of Black boys who are in foster care at that age range who are being suspended. Think about the implications of that. You have children who have, you end up in foster care because of instability, because of emotional toil that may happen because of some instability. And think about then to then go into a learning environment, which should be that safe place, which should be that harbor, and to unfortunately find that it provides the exact opposite for our most disproportionately impacted populations. And for this, when we look at that for foster youth, it's pretty concerning. But when we think about the suspension rates in K12 education, the highest suspension rates are in middle school. And we see that for Black students in middle school, their rates are much higher, and particularly for Black boys, it's 19.1%. And that is an important data point, but it also overshadows an incredibly important additional point that we have to consider. When we look at suspensions, it's not simply just the percentage itself, but the ratio between Black students and, say, their peers. And what we find is that the highest suspension rates aren't in high school, they're not in middle school, and they're not even in latter elementary. They're in early childhood education, where Black children are 522% more likely to be suspended than their peers. Think about the implications of that. The greatest disproportionality is for the youngest of our children that we're serving. And that is why we have titled this webinar presentation, Banning Our Babies. And of course, they're not actually babies at this point. It's a metaphor to really illuminate what we're doing to our youngest and most vulnerable young children. And with that, I'm going to turn it over briefly to my colleague, Mohammed Kass, who's going to talk about some of the data that he's been able to look at as it relates to some of our larger districts within the state. Mohammed.
Thank you, Dr. Wood, and I'd like to thank everyone for joining this webinar. As Dr. Wood mentioned, suspensions and expulsions are stressful for both the student and the parent, but unlike the parents, the young children often do not have the skill set to speak up and to be able to advocate for themselves, making them voiceless and vulnerable. These experiences could also have a negative could also cause, this young group of children to have negative attitudes towards school, possibly causing them to withdraw from the classroom setting, and causing other things such as having low confidence socially, and to not succeed both socially and academically. So if we look at some of this data I pulled for Sacramento City Unified School District, the suspensions versus the statewide average, the data shows that Black males in K-3 are suspended at a rate that's 12 times higher than the state average. So the blue graph shows that they're being suspended. K-12 Black males are being suspended at a rate that's 10.5%, while the green shows the statewide average. And we can move to the next slide. This is for, these are the suspension rates for San Diego Unified School District. And as we look at the data, again, Black males in K-3 are suspended at a rate that's 6 times higher than the state average. Again, this is a very vulnerable group that does not really have the skills to be able to advocate for themselves or to even speak up. And this data is actually reported by the districts to the schools. So this isn't new data. This isn't data that we collected. This is actually data that was provided to from the school to the district. And I decided to pull 3 school districts: San Diego Unified, Sac City Unified, and LA Unified. And out of the 3, LA Unified School District has the lowest suspension rates, and I can show that in the next slide. So this is the data set for Los Angeles Unified School District. Again, these rates are low, but in my opinion, I don't believe that any child in K-3 should be suspended at all. Schools should definitely be implementing and deploying different resources to make sure that this doesn't happen. And in Los Angeles Unified School District, K-3 students are suspended at a rate that's 1.1 times higher than the state average. And please feel free to screenshot these data points and to post them on social media using the hashtags Stop School Suspension. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. I'm going to make one quick change here, and here we go. So I want to just close off our section with this by just highlighting some data that we've had collected from the parents of Black children during COVID-19. I'm going to talk about the quantitative aspect of this project, and then when we transition it to Doctors Essien and Dejanette, that will talk about the qualitative aspect of it. But we've been surveying parents throughout the pandemic, really trying to understand how are their children experiencing schooling environments. And we have seen some really concerning patterns from that. We have collected narratives from over 1,000 parents of Black children, and we've collected quantitative data from over 500 parents. And here's some of the things that we are seeing: that educators are surprised when Black children succeed academically. Over 36% of parents agree that that is the statement that they've experienced during the pandemic era. That they immediately discipline their child for perceived wrongdoing, and they single them out for punishment even when they're doing things that are analogous to that of their peers. So same actions, but a different response. And we believe that that response is really a function of racial identity. And they've also said that there are high percentage of these parents that they mistakenly identified their child as the one who did wrong, even when they did not. Over the pandemic era, we've seen some increases in some of these different data points. You can look at from May and July of 2020 to February and April of 2021. We have a new collection that hopefully will be available to us in a couple months. That basically can see that the biggest area where there was an increase, the biggest 2 areas, was that they were surprised when their child succeeded academically, and they put down their child in public when they provided a wrong answer. Those, of course, aren't the types of things that we'd like to see in terms of building the type of environments that are necessary to support our Black students. And then I'd like to close by just offering why this matters. And I think that we have to be informed by the work of Dr. William Smith from the University of Utah, who's done incredible work on racial battle fatigue. And what he's shown is that when students are in environments that are racist, whether that is explicitly racist or even tacitly, right, beneath the surface, that there is an effect. There's an effect cognitively in their ability to be able to process information. There's a psychological impact in terms of anxiety, in terms of hope and hopelessness. And there's a physiological impact on their bodies. Some of those physiological impacts can include a tension headache, a backache, an elevated heartbeat, an upset stomach. And that's one I want to hone in on, because that's the one I see oftentimes when we're talking about ECE. A young child in kindergarten doesn't have necessarily the language to say to their parent, I'm being microaggressed, right? Or I'm in an environment where my teacher is not supporting me. They might not have that language yet, but they do know how to say this: I don't want to go to school today. The parent asks why, and they say, because my stomach hurts, because their body is having a physiological response, a physical response to an environment that was not suited to support them in their success. In addition to that, we also know that there are psychological impacts: constant anxiety and worrying, loss of confidence, frustration, emotional and social withdrawal. These, of course, are not the recipe for student success, but the recipe for the school to prison pipeline. And we want to change that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues, Dr. Essian and Dr. Dejanette, who are going to highlight some of the work that they've been doing looking at this from a different perspective. So just one moment, please, and I will transition it to them.
Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Idara Essian, and I'm an assistant professor in child and family development at San Diego State University. I am joined by my amazing colleague and friend, Dr. Michelle Dejanette, who is also a faculty member in child and family development at San Diego State University. The title of my project or presentation is called Our Voices, and it is a national project on Black children and early learning. And I have been participating in this project or doing this project since 2015 with my colleague and partner, Dr. J. Luke Wood. We typically start off our presentations by a quote by the late Dr. Asa Hilliard. And for those who don't know who Dr. Hilliard is, he was an amazing scholar, psychologist, and educator who did work on Black students in education. And he noted here in this quote, "I've never encountered any children in any group who are not geniuses. There is no mystery on how to teach them. The first thing you do is treat them like human beings. And the second thing you do is love them." Over the past few years, I've been involved in a few reports, a few exclusionary discipline reports. One is titled Suspending Our Future. You can access this report at the bit.ly below. Another report that we have been involved in is titled When They Teach Us, and it's a brief for the parents of Black children in San Diego public schools. And you can access this report through bmmcoalition.com. So again, I want you to keep this in mind. I know that Dr. Wood did go over the 3Ds with his work and Dr. Harris's work on the distrust, disdain, and disregard of Black children in education. So keep this in mind as we are moving through the themes of our project. So in our report or in our national project, we have collected over 1,000 narratives nationally. And it has been based upon the experiences of Black children in education across the nation. And we believe that their experiences have been typified by microaggressions. There were 3 themes that came up. One theme that I will discuss is titled Assumptions of Criminality. And assumptions of criminality involved a few sub-themes where children were assumed to be troublemakers, that they were labeled using criminalized terms, that they were hyper-surveilled and monitored, even if there was no wrongdoing. They were singled out for discipline, that they were subject to harsher punishment if there was punishment, and that they were also viewed through a disorder-based lens. What we saw with the assumptions of to assume to be troublemakers is that even if there were other children involved in an issue, that they were targeted and assumed to be the troublemaker within that issue. One parent quote noted, "I have seen the assistant teacher going into a verbal battle with my son. As my son was trying to explain the situation, the teacher said, 'Well, the other kid said you started it,' and took his word for it without even hearing from my son." And so we saw that quite often. We also saw that whenever there were interactions or descriptions of Black children within our study, is that they were labeled with criminalized terms. They were labeled in a way where they were busy or physical or aggressive or destructive or defiant, hyperactive, anything negative, distracted, the troublemaker. We did speak about that just now. And if they were within a group of students, that they were definitely more targeted and hyper surveilled, even if there was no wrongdoing, very similar to the Walter Gilliam's work. One parent noted, "I would also witness them constantly watching my son when I brought it up. They denied it. I explained that of course they would see him doing more things if they were always watching him. I witnessed other children doing the same things and no one would even engage them. He was the only Black kid in the school." So that leads me to being singled out. There will be instances within our study, and we would see patterns in which children would be playing with other children. And if they didn't share that same racial identity, that they would be singled out for discipline. Even if they were all doing the same thing, it could be throwing rocks, or it could be age appropriate things where it was like physical play. But it was where that they were singled out for discipline quite often. This parent wrote, "In first grade, my son was regularly sent home with notes regarding minor infractions. When I questioned him, he mentioned how 3 or 4 other boys, they didn't share the same racial identity, were also doing the same thing, but they didn't get in trouble." That leads me to being subject to harsher punishment. So when they were being singled out, they were being more harshly punished as well. And it seemed as if they were more harshly punished, they were more stern. It would result in the whole day of being marked bad, and the teacher would prolong the punishment. There were names that were being called as well, coming from the teachers, and almost to the point where the students and the parents felt that there was a lot of yelling that happened as well. Another theme that came up, our last theme that came up, was the view of being through a disorder-based lens. There was a lot of labeling, a lot of questions about behavioral disorders. One parent mentioned, we had a teacher mention that she thought my daughter had ADHD and would need special services for her attention. And it turned out that all of the Black students in the class all received the same label. Or it would be where there wasn't an intervention or any interactions with the parents. And so they would also create this label. So another thing that we saw, so Dr. Wood mentioned how our data was separated. So we have data that was done before COVID and during COVID. During COVID, what we noticed, the themes that we noticed, is that the children were being treated as second-class citizens. They were treated as a distraction. They would call on every other student but their child. They would ignore their children. And if they called on the child, it was almost like, oh, there was a sigh, like, okay, go ahead, go ahead and answer. They would ignore their hands that were being raised in the Zoom call. They would cut them off while they were talking. And it was almost as if the children picked it up. They knew that this treatment was due to race. As you can see at the very bottom, the quote says, "Mom, it's not fair. She never calls on me because I'm Black." And this had an impact on their differential treatment. It had an impact on their mood, on who they were. It was almost as if their spirits were stripped, as a parent described it. Their mood changed. It was deflated. She completely withdrew. They completely withdrew. They wouldn't raise their hands, they wouldn't participate because honestly, they weren't valued in those classrooms. And so this next slide, we have a parent training video that we collectively did together. Dr. Michelle Desjardins did an amazing job with interviewing these parents. And I really want you to listen in on how these parents really feel about their experiences with their children. And it mirrors what we've seen in our work and some of the solutions that they have. So.
Age appropriate behaviors. I think physical play outside that, it becomes physical. Kids get knocked down. Kids start to argue outside. That just happens. Kids argue, and it's not something that you turn into a punishment or write up, written a call home. No, you just sit down and you mediate that, and you teach children how to deal with situations where you and another human aren't agreeing on something. And how do you get through that disagreement without needing that other person to agree with you at the end of the conversation? And you can still move forward with your day in a productive way. Or we have kids that are, being suspended, or, oh, he pushed him. Well, yeah, he's 7. Kids push each other. That's an opportunity. That's supposed to be an opportunity to sit down and have a conversation about conflict. And that throughout life, there's always going to be people disagreeing with us, But instead of using that opportunity, we're completely missing those opportunities in schools, and we're punishing the children. They're getting a bad taste in their mouth about school. Those eventually become the kids who will ditch school. They don't want to be at school. School isn't a warm place. It's not welcoming. It's where they're rejected. It's where they're constantly in trouble. It's where the teachers are looking down at them. The teacher sees them walk into class and takes a deep breath because there goes their day. I think it's ongoing.
I want them to start asking the right questions. I want them to understand that this black kid also has parents, just like this white kid does. I honestly just wish I can get some sort of a communication. I want them to not rush into conclusion and just automatically make the black kid the criminal, criminalizing our kids. I want them to actually understand the situation from both sides, like hear both sides of the stories, and base their judgment on the character of the student they have in class and not just the fact that he's black. I wish principals would talk to their staff and have a protocol in place. I wish that, just like I told my principal recently, I wish there would be a red flag. Just like there's a fire hazard, so there's a red flag. There's a kidnapping, red flag. Racial issues should be a red flag as well.
I was a first grade teacher, and she always, I did surprise pop-ups at school. She always got down ground level to do eye to eye. That's so important. It's so simple, but it's so important. She maintained her composure. If she was stressed, her voice never showed that. I think maintaining, she was just always very kind. And to get down onto a child's level and have a conversation where you're physically at the same level with them, I've seen that the outcome is much different. The connection is sincere and it's fruitful.
What's interesting about, it's very interesting how my research and the research done by Drs. Wood and SEN coincide. When as you heard, there are experiences shared by the parents and by the young children, talking to their parents about what they experience in school. My research showed the flip side of that, which made their work make sense, right? I interviewed teachers about their discipline beliefs in preschool. Next slide, please. And so when we talk about, when Dr. Essien talked about how our children are being labeled, right, as far as being aggressive and defiant and being singled out for many times age-appropriate behavior that other children do also, but Black and brown children seem to be punished for it and more harshly punished. One of the teachers I spoke to who works in a state-funded preschool program said that we definitely have both African-American and Latino boys who talk about superhero movies and that they're watching at home. And this is way too aggressive and unacceptable at school, which again, coincides with what the parents told Dr. Essien and Dr. Wood, that their children are later labeled as aggressive. Well, we know that many children, not just Black and Latino children, like to pretend to be superheroes, but when Black and brown children do it, it's labeled as aggressive, right? Next slide, please. And then other areas of discipline where the themes that came out of my data were this issue of power and control, right? One teacher said that if children had any type of behavioral difficulties, like being disrespectful or saying no, we put them on a behavior contract, like a 3 strikes, you're out kind of thing. And again, which aligns with the work of Dr. Essien and Dr. Wood as far as assumptions of criminality, and the work of Black Minds Matter, which really looks at how society views and labels and criminalizes Black males and how this behavior is mirrored in our schools, right? So 3 strikes is language that is used in the criminal justice system. So it's very interesting that preschool teachers would use this type of language when it comes to disciplining our young children. Another teacher said that she wanted her whole class to be silent, and we're not going outside until everyone is silent. Well, we're talking about 24, 3-year-olds, right? And so it's an unrealistic expectation, and you're punishing children, again, for doing what's developmentally appropriate for them to do, and also taking away their right to outside play as a form of punishment. Next slide, please. So the first parent talked about children, being excessively disciplined and that resulting in them, having a bad taste in their mouth, is the way she put it, towards school, right? Because we know that excessive discipline leads to a lack of sense of belonging in school, right? Children don't believe they belong in school, that school's not a place for them if they're going to keep getting in trouble. And then she also mentioned them ditching school. Well, research has shown that when children start getting disciplined earlier and repeatedly, they do eventually drop out of school and end up in getting in trouble in the criminal justice system and end up a higher likelihood of being incarcerated. And this is what we call the school to prison pipeline. Next slide. So some of the solutions that I came to from my research is that, as along with what the second parent said about what the principal and what teachers could do, in her words, is that we should have a red flag, right? We noticed in our research that when issues of race and racism occur in schools, teachers aren't prepared to handle them, right? They don't know what to do. And this is because teachers are not being trained in anti-racism, right? They're not understanding what racism is, how it occurs in society and replicated in schools, and they're not trained in how to deal with those situations. So some of the solutions are that, of course, anti-racism training should be a mandatory component of pre-service and in-service teacher training. And that should be followed up with in-class observations and mentoring, so that not only do teachers understand anti-racism, but also understand what it means to be an anti-racist educator and how that shows up in the classroom. Also, discipline data should be monitored regularly. If we collected data on who's disciplined and how often, and if that's disaggregated by race and gender, we're able to identify patterns of disproportionality. And we're able to see if the policies that are in place have a disproportionately negative effect on certain students. And by doing this, we're able to revisit our policies, right? And be able to create more equitable discipline and behavior guidance policies.
All right, so we are going to turn it over to our colleagues from Peach.
Okay, as you can see, the QR code is still available for you to put in to receive one of the free books. We're giving away 30 free books, and the QR code is right here, Black History Month. Next slide, please. So all of us have probably been in education, or there's many of us that have been in education, and we all have great stories, some not so great, of working with children. So I'm going to share with you as an education leader, I'm going to share with you one of my stories. We had a teacher share with one of our 3-year-olds that she would grow up and be on welfare, and told the parents that this child was going to grow up and be on welfare. Now, how are we predicting a 3-year-old child? A 3-year-old child is going to grow up and be on welfare. We as educators have so much power by what we say and what we do in our classrooms. We have to acknowledge that power. And to put that on a 3-year-old child that we're predicting the future just isn't right, right? So there's a problem. So I have on here, Houston, we have a problem. I'm originally from Texas, and we all know that from the space, Houston, we have a problem. So in America, we have a problem. We have a problem. Can I have next slide, please? We have a problem when we don't acknowledge our power. The power of educators, especially education leaders. And I'm speaking to our education leaders now. Doing nothing is not an option. There are no abstentions, right? There are no extensions in the lives of our children. You know, my grandmother used to say, you gotta poop or get off the pot. I'm sure a lot of your grandmothers probably said that. As an education leader, you've gotta take a stand. You must take a stand. There's no neutrality. So those who lead schools where our children are Black children's beauty, brilliance, and bravery is not being acknowledged, valued, and celebrated, it's a problem. As an educator, we wield so much power over students. We can motivate, encourage, and empower students to make them believe the sky is the limit. But we can also dehumanize, devalue, and destroy, and destroy, and destroy their sense of well-being, their safety, and neglect to provide them a place to nourish where they will flourish. So how do we do this? We do this by the selection of staff members. Do they see themselves represented in the faculty and staff at your school? Can they look around and see people that look like them? What we decide to teach, are they represented in the curriculum And if so, how are they represented in the curriculum, right? Who do we serve? What policies or procedures are in place? And how are they enforced? On whom are they enforced? Are our Black boys being singled out? We have to think about it. Every decision we make shows how children will see this world. And our job as school leaders is to ensure that each and every child lives up to their full potential. Now, I know I'm speaking to people in the back. I would say speaking to people in the back of the room or people in the back of the webinar. And they say, hey, LaTanya, but what about these parents? These parents do X, Y, and Z. And I will tell you what my grandmother used to say. But right now, we're talking about you. So education leaders, but right now, we're talking about you. So you as that school leader, you have so much power, and it's wonderful, and it's right, and it's what should happen when you yield that power the right way to serve children, especially our children that are being dehumanized. Next slide, please. Suspended school suspension and expulsion, co-signing. So think about this. In business, a co-signer, and I looked it up for this presentation, a co-signer is a person who pledges to pay back the loan if the purchaser does not make the payments. So when we think about it, in most schools, a teacher cannot suspend a child without an administrator signing off on it or co-signing. So school leaders, what are you co-signing on? Are you co-signing on the inequities that seem commonplace in early learning environments? Or are you clear on your vision of what you want for children and families? As a school leader, I do not get out of my little gray Prius. It's right outside the doors every day without a prayer that I do right by the children and families I serve. That I honor the parents. That I honor that the parents are giving me the most valued beings by letting me have their children for the hours in the school day. And for lack of a better analogy, it's like borrowing a friend's car and they loan it to you to drive for the weekend. And when you get the car, right, it only has a half a tank of gas and could use a wash, right? But however, when you return that car over the weekend to your friend, you return it with a full tank of gas and it's washed. We have children in our schools for X number of hours each day. We are to return children to their parents better than they came. And how do we do this? By embracing and loving on them. We would never take a car from a friend and do donuts and drive reckless, right? Because it doesn't belong to us, right? And as such, we have people's children in our schools, and we can't be reckless with other people's children, right? Next slide, please. What's love got to do with it? Now, I'm sure a lot of you remember that famous Tina Turner song, What's Love Got to do with it, right? What's love but a second-hand emotion? I believe that education, that love means a lot. And loving children, especially our Black children, who routinely and systematically are removed from a place called school, a place that's supposed to be welcoming and inviting, a place that is to nourish and encourage, a place where you're to be celebrated and not tolerated. If you cannot love the Black children you serve, we have a problem. If you're not willing to self-reflect on how you can help with the suspension and expulsion of Black children, we have a problem. Justice Coles, an educational scholar, said every educator needs to be aware of the anti-Blackness that is pervasive in many schools because it impacts the development and perspective of all children. All children. Next slide, please. So how do we do this? You're saying, LaTanya, you run your center here at Trade Tech in downtown. How do we do this? It's by working together. So transforming to a responsive environment, welcoming environment. We got to get to know the families you serve and build sustaining relationships. This means being open to listen to the good and the bad. And I know as educators, we might say, but we're the ones with the college degrees, right? But nobody knows their child better than that parent. And we can't think that our way is the best way. We've got to be open to listen, to work together. Also, we've got to look at our representation in the building. What does your faculty and staff look like? What books and materials are represented? Are we just going to be neutral? We can't be neutral. School administrators, look for ways to remove barriers. So when was the last training on ACEs, for example, adverse childhood experiences for your staff, right? What training have your school attended on cultural relevant teaching or social justice and anti-Black resources? Are anti-Black resources being incorporated throughout the school? We have to have deep conversations about issues of race and biases. We have to see and value all the great things that Black children bring into the school environment. And most of all, we must love them because they have so much to give and they are so valuable. Next slide, please.
Thank you so much, LaTanya, for sharing. That was so powerful and so just inspiring to hear. I'm delighted to be here. My name is Alma Cortez, and I'm a professor at Pierce College in the Child Development Department, and I'm really honored to be among the speakers today. And I'm here to tell you a little bit about my story, but I first want to acknowledge all of the wonderful sharing that's been happening in the chat throughout. A lot of you have been very brave and also very open about the struggles that you may have had as teachers, as parents, and part of what I want to share with you today is that I have this quote from Mr. Rogers to start with, and I'm not going to read it to you, but I really want to share with you that I'm here because there isn't really such a thing as other people's children, right? Because it is our collective responsibility, and I'm paraphrasing, to share in raising our children together. And if we're not raising them and treating all of our kids as equally or equitably, then we're really doing them a disservice, as you've all heard today. And so what I want to talk to you about today is my own personal story of struggle. When I'm a proud parent of 2 young children, and my son, when he was in preschool, partly because of COVID, but also because I think it's just part of who he was. He was struggling. He was in a space that was, I think, feeling like, he was a little bit of like in that discomfort, a little bit moving towards, I want to be here, I want to do this, I want to do all these big things. And he really struggled in some ways with some challenging and with challenges in the classroom. And what I kept hearing were things like aggressive. So a lot of the words have been said, some behavior that was not so great, that he's really having a hard time, that he's not doing all these things. And so my struggle with a lot of what has been talked about today is about the fact that it's what are we really doing for our children in our classrooms? What is the aim of their time in preschool? Is it supposed to be, as some people share in the chat, sitting quietly and listening? And what 3-year-old actually does that? And what 4-year-old does that? And what 5-year-old, for that matter, sits and listens, crisscross applesauce, so to speak. And so what you've heard a lot of today is about the biases that we have sometimes encountered in early childhood classrooms. And I think there are, to some extent, some biases with boys. And so I've heard Dr. Asim Gilmore talk about the pedagogy of no, that we're constantly telling our kids no, whether male or female, right? No, it's not time to go outside. No, you cannot play with that toy. And so we do need to be a little bit more intentional with creating spaces where we are helping our children to feel empowered, to feel that they can, that this is their safe space, as has been shared. And so as teachers, and you've heard from Latanya as administrator, we should be sensitive, intentional, responsibly, and really think about what's developmentally appropriate. And maybe not necessarily in the ways in which we've thought about before. What is also going to be, next slide, please. Culturally appropriate, right? And culturally responsive. So as early educators, we really want to make that learning that's happening in the classroom, the play, the intention of working with blocks or working with manipulatives, really intentional and relevant to what the child is experiencing on a day-to-day basis, and culturally responsive. So I reference some of my early childhood heroes, John Dewey, who looked at what's relevant in our students' lives in their day-to-day, and that we are learning by doing. And that, again, sitting and being quiet isn't necessarily going to help with our children learning, but it is, but that learning by doing is really, really crucial to their education. And this is their start. This is where we want them to begin their journey, and we want them to really love going to school. And I also think of Gloria Ladson-Billings, who talked about being culturally responsive, right? And empowering our kids to be intellectually, socially, emotionally, politically, and using those references to impart knowledge, skills, and attitudes to our kids. So essentially, really thinking about what are the kids interested? If they are interested in superhero play, how can we manifest that in a way that makes sense for our classroom? If they are interested in lots of movement and activities, how are we going to make that as a part of their day-to-day, right? And if they are really interested in just moving around like my kid, maybe they need a little bit more extra time. And so as of now, he is in a classroom where his teachers really understand him. They have been they give him extra time to climb the structure. They give him extra time to run outside when they know that he needs it. They're not kind of dumbing it down and making him do the things that they need him to do. And they know that at some point he's going to get to that space where he can move with a group or not, and let everybody know that I need a minute or I need some space. And so they're giving him and empowering him in the same way. I'm gonna, next slide, please. So what is the deal with our big boys, right? With our boys, and what is developmentally appropriate? And is that even something that is culturally responsive? So we know that they need they have those big body movements. We know that they sometimes need that time to just relax, take a minute. And we also know that they need time for breaks and to process information. And so those are the things that I want to make sure that we honor. And again, as a collective responsibility for all of our children, and to ensure that they have a safe space to be in the classroom. Oops, sorry. Next slide, please. So I do want to talk about the NEYC, right, and anti-bias education. So, and you see this word transforming because as early educators, many of us may be familiar with the National Association for the Education of Young Children and the work that they've done in anti-bias education. And so in the late 80s, this came out, and it really looked at this idea of supporting children who have been hurt, helping them through their way, and then looking at negotiating cultural differences or looking at issues of class and privilege. And recently in 2020, they came out with their next edition, which is more along the lines of what we've been speaking about today, things that are culturally relevant. How do we make that more of an ongoing practice in the classroom, in all of our classrooms? It really puts that context of the family and the child in perspective, and it really encourages our teachers to see the whole child. So much of what you've heard already from myself and from my colleagues, as well as our San Diego State team, we really wanted this is one of the tools that might help for educators who are looking for a resource to share. But it's also just an ongoing kind of transformation. Next slide, please. And an evolution of early childhood, which is what we're really looking at, right? What do we need now? We need teachers who can see the child as who they are, teachers who understand and can appreciate families with different dynamics. Maybe there are some families that have dinner at very different times of day than each other. And so sitting down for one meal is a really hard thing for a preschooler child to do. There are some families that maybe have never introduced their children or have never been able to introduce their children to paint or scissors. And so being really just understanding that that's just a different experience in different families. We also want to be able to understand how to communicate with teachers about the needs of our children and temperament. I was very, very clear with my children's preschool teachers and its current teachers that this is kind of who he is. And I don't want him to lose that spark. It's a really important part of who he is and who he's going to be. And we don't want that for any of our children. And we want to make sure we're being collaborative in that process of understanding one another. How often are we checking in? How often are we having conferences and or just even quick emails? And I know for me personally, having that kind of bi-weekly or weekly communication with the teachers was really, really important, especially when we could not physically drop off our kids in a classroom. I believe that is my last slide. Thank you so much. I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Keisha.
Thank you, Latanya, and thank you, Alma, and thank you, San Diego State team. So I want to share a little bit about my story. And so what I believe to be true is you have to look at the importance of beginning with your own self, right? So thinking about where I want to be, what does this mean? And so I would like to be inspired by Tolstoy's quote, "Everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing themselves." So when we go through this journey, and as my colleagues and friends have talked with you, I want to share something about my journey with you. And so I want us to continue to be inspired by the work of John Lewis. Many of you will remember he talked about getting into good trouble. And so we had a training and there was a conversation around this word accomplice. And I have to say that in my experience and in my world, accomplice is usually not a positive term. It's not something I want to be known as necessarily. And so as we're doing some work and processing about becoming a more than just an advocate, and talking about where we want to go next. So I had a conversation with Dr. Gloria Boutte about this word accomplice, and she defined it in the words in the orange that I want to share with you. An accomplice aids in the idea of standing together in critical ways regarding the advocacy for minoritized groups. And that made me think about accomplice in a different way. So part of the journey is beginning to look at your own self and beginning to change the meanings of words and change the meanings of experience and change experiences that you've had personally, moving yourself towards this transformation. And so again, we were inspired by continuing to do some work with the Anti-Racist Coalition at the University of South Carolina. And I want to also, one of the things that came across to us, and one of the things that really touched me and touched my soul in a way that hadn't touched me before, are these words. And thinking about the preparation of early childhood educators. So looking at preparing the field, and we talk about preparing the field of child development all the time. We talk about the things that we've done, our experiences, and so on, but looking at it from a place of all children, Black children, and children of color, and looking at it for the next generation. And then also not just the next generation, but also the generation of adults. And then not just the children and generation and the adults, but looking at the institutions and how that some of the information that we share continues to aid in this anti-Blackness that happens in the school settings, not just in the preschool settings, but also in our college settings. And remembering that it is up to us to not be silent anymore and to take these actions. And so when continuing this conversation and this thought around information, so you go to workshops, you go to seminars, you're here at this webinar, you're in a classroom, and information keeps coming at you. And sometimes information comes from you and information comes to you, right? And so it's important to think that information is both gathered and it is received. And then information we are saying needs to be acted upon. And so what we have said and what we are looking at and where our journey is taking us and moving us forward is we want to encourage bravery. It takes a lot to be a person of color, particularly a Black woman, in a field that's mostly middle-class white women, and to say, this is anti-Blackness. We want to encourage bravery. We want to be engaging in this self-awareness, in my self-awareness as well as my colleagues. It's important for us to be understanding and to take a look and recognize our own responsibilities, which is what LaTanya shared, Alma has shared, and then looking at the numbers and the statistics that they have shown us from San Diego State. We have to look at this acceptance. We have to know that without change, without real change, it's not going to get better. And then from the work of Dr. Bettina Love, I am just in awe of her work. I encourage you to seek out her work and what she talks about in this recognizing spirit murdering. Now, for a long time, and for many of you out there who have been in the field, we have, I know many of you are the Nonviolent Campaign, and we talk a lot about nonviolence in early care and education and not having children play with guns and all of these different things. But and this word spirit murdering might come and you might feel that discomfort we talked about. But remember, we said discomfort is part of the process. That disequilibrium is a necessity in order for us to move through and move forward. And when you think about what is happening to Black children and brown children in our programs, as adults, as children, and so on, when you really look at what she discusses and what was shared, spirit murdering is actually what is happening to our children. She continues to also say that we need to identify the bullets in which this spirit murdering happens. Are we being inclusive or are we being denying? Are we protecting to the utmost? Are we nurturing beyond what we understand and nurturing the all of the child? We talk about the whole child. Well, what does that mean? And so, as we shared before about this bullets of disrespect or silencing, this shushing, right? This rejection, this omission. Even the smallest thing becomes this huge snowball of effects of not wanting to come to school or not wanting to be a part, right? And then it's important for us to recognize that racism is not just done by bad people. I can think about the people in my own life in other students' lives. I can think about people from the time I started schooling up until getting a master's degree. I wouldn't say that those people were bad people. I'm going to leave that as a point. So in this talking about information and moving forward, and what are we looking at, and what are some of the things that can happen? I mean, we all can talk about what's wrong, but can we talk about solving? And so here's one of the things that I've brought to the classroom, and some of my other colleagues have brought to the classroom. Let me introduce to you Doctors Kenneth and Mamie Clark. Some of you may know their names, and some of you may not have ever heard of them, but I probably hope that you've at least heard about the doll test. So in 1932, Mamie and Kenneth Clark put together the doll test. And what they did is they wanted to look at the sense of self-esteem that Black children had. And so in their work, they brought children in front of them, and they shared two dolls, a Black doll and a white doll. And then they said to them, ask them questions about the dolls. And so I encourage you to continue to look at some of the video footage and some of the findings, but you can probably already note just from our conversations today. And if you've looked at the 2010 re-experiment that CNN had and MSNBC and several others had, the same results came true again. Black children saw the doll and then therefore saw themselves as the bad child, the one that got into trouble, the one that they didn't want to be like. So in 2020, Dr. Tony Serdevant from Texas A&M tweaked this research, and she took 4 dolls, which are pictured before you. And instead of asking children questions about the dolls, she decided to put the dolls in the learning environment, which we have done many times. So she put 4 dolls in the learning environment: a Black doll, a white doll, a Hispanic doll, and a doll that looked of mixed origin or mixed nationality. And so she observed the children and observed them in play. And I'm sure there was part of her hopes was that now this is 2020, something should be different. Something should have changed. Well, when you read the article, you will see that not very many things have changed. What I will leave with you is that the Black doll was placed on the floor quite often. There were times that children even kicked the Black doll. There were times that the Black doll was just thrown to the side and mistreated. There was even a child that decided that they were going to cook the Black doll in her pot for a dramatic play. So looking at transformation. So I shared that slide and that information to tell you that a year ago, I added this conversation to my lectures. At the end of the year and the end of the semester, like many of my colleagues, I asked the students, what was the one thing that stood out to you? What was something that you really learned from or helped you in our topics? 80% of my students, who were all Caucasian, by the way, said that the Black doll test still stood out to them. They were still thinking about that, still wondering about that, still trying to analyze that and process that and what that meant. And so I would encourage you, as I encouraged myself, to continue looking at ways we can add more conversations and more researchers such as Dr. Nathaniel Bryan. So many of you, I'm sure, will remember, and for those of you who are students, and so I'm so excited to see my students and other students on today, but you'll remember Mildred Parton, or at least you might remember the stages of play. So these words should look familiar to you. Unoccupied, solitary, onlooker, right? So the stages of play that Mildred Parton came up with in 1932. And so we talk about these in almost every class, curriculum classes, theory classes, etc. And so why not, when we're talking about Mildred Parton and her stages of play and talking about cooperative play and associative play and parallel play and what those things mean, why not include Dr. Nathaniel Bryan's work? Dr. Nathaniel Bryan is from the University of Miami, and he talks about Black boys and their play. He also, when you look at his research and you read his articles, he comes from a place of saying curriculum is built on the experiences of white children. Teaching is informed by white cultural ways of knowing and being. Now, take a moment with that. Sit on that for a minute. So then as we continue to share and talk with our students, and we talk about these play patterns, why not engage and talk about the importance of how Black boys play? And I would extend this to Black girls. I would extend this to Latinx and Hispanic children as well. When they play, they are brilliant. Their play allows them to operate within cultural existence. Playtime is an educational right, because one of the things that he noted in his research is that particularly large amounts of Black boys and Black children are restricted from play as punishment. When from the deep depths of our soul, we are taught that play is children's work. ECE says play is the most important things that children can do. And so why is it that we are taking away the very thing that we're saying that is the most important thing for them? He goes on to say that play allows them to be fully human. Play cultivates Black masculinity, and play should highlight their joys and the potential possibilities. So I encourage my colleagues and my peers to continue to look at work like from Nathaniel Bryan. And as we come from transformation to evolution, let's think about this recognizing. Let's recognize that although you may not have personally have any responsibility of where we are, as I've heard people say, well, I've never owned any slaves. And although you may not have personally been responsible for dismantling anything or harming anyone directly, we have to remember that this is something that we all have to be a part to, that this is the village and the support that we all have to lend to. I encourage you to disrupt misinformation as you hear it. I encourage you to seek the work of Black scholars like Dr. Nathaniel, like Amar Gilmore that Alma spoke of, and other works, even from our colleagues, Dr. Wood, Dr. Isan, and newly Dr. Dejanet. Think about following the insights of Black scholars. Why aren't we following them? I should be able to say Dr. Bryan's name as much and quickly as I say Vygotsky or Erickson or Piaget. Let's commit to making a change, even whether it's a small change, a great change, as long as we are moving forward. So what are we saying that we can do? What are we saying about the call to action, the call to advocate, the call to be an accomplice. I sit here before you with my colleagues and I smile and I call myself an accomplice. And so here's some thoughts about what we can do with our students. And students, here's some thoughts what you can do for yourselves and encourage your professors to assist you in. But the first thing I want to encourage you to do is I want to encourage you to be brave. For this is not a destination, this is a journey. I want you to remember that we all have to come to terms with our own bias. We all have them. Look at the communities that can happen, the communities of practice, shares communities. We can put together some book clubs, some clubhouse groups. You're already attending webinars, so you're taking some of the first steps. There's trainings and so on. For educators, this is the one that I think sometimes we have to take a moment and honestly ask yourself, be true to yourself. What do I need to unlearn? What do I need to unlearn? What do I need to reteach? And what do I need in order to move forward? A lot has been done. There's a lot of work for us to move ahead. Start with one thing. Change one PowerPoint slide. Include W.E.B. Du Bois in your slide for your community, child family community class when he talks about the souls of Black folks. Look at the work that we've shared with you today. Ask your students some questions about their stories and be open to hearing about that, adding that into your course. Look at the demographics that's within and the traumas and what's happening with students, not just your students in your classroom, but look at the students that are in the neighborhood. Look at the teachers that we are working with. It's time for us to continue to build empathy and really dive into the empathy within early childhood. We can create these societal connections. And please, let's recognize the microaggressions. And when people come to you and say something to you about an aggression, try not to take things so personally. And keep in mind that race lighting is real and people are experiencing it every single day. Let's keep in mind some of the laws and other things that have happened and that have passed that have hurt people of color, people linguistically, and so on. And I will call out that when you're thinking about DLL, second language learners, dual language learners, or whatever you'd like to call it, keep in mind that Ebonics is real. There is a real language that we as Black Americans have, and it needs to be called out and addressed. I'd like us to end with my friend, LaTanya, and as she shares the rest of her story. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Keisha. That was wonderful. And so when I started the story, I talked to you about the child who the teacher told them that they would be on welfare and told the parents that this child was going to be on welfare. So how the story ends is those parents elected to remove their child from the program, right? You want to put your child in a situation where they feel loved, where they feel valued, where they are there to be nourished and encouraged and celebrated, right? So we have to take comfort in discomfort. So I, as an educational leader at LA Trade Tech College and working also as an adjunct at Merced, we have to change our way of thinking, and we have to take comfort in the discomfort and working with children and working with students. How does the child feel when we make decisions? We're making decisions. How is this going to impact children? How do we do right by the child? And in what ways am I supporting teachers? Because I know administrators, when they've been heard me speak earlier, they're thinking about, but what about the teachers? But what about this? But what about that? It's all working together. I'm starting here, but it doesn't end here. We know that teachers need encouragement and support also, right? How much time as an administrator, we have to think about and reflect, self-reflect. How much time do we spend in the classroom? Are we just in our office doing reports? How much time are we getting out and walking in those classrooms and spending time with those children? Do they know us by name? Instead of that's the person in the office down the hall, right? What choices are you making as a leader that has an impact on children? Because we've spoken about the love of children and doing right by children and not co-signing, right? And where do we need to train or improve in our training for children, right? We've spoken about ACEs, and there's so many vast opportunities for training. And also we have to look at linguistic sabotage. When we tell students or parents, really, maybe this is not a good school, best suited for your child, and it will be better off at the school down the street, right? Some of us have heard those language, or we have friends that have heard that language. Oh, well, maybe they might be better suited because the teacher doesn't want to really work and do the work that is needed to benefit that child, right? So they try to look for alternatives. So we have to look at how we're working with children, how we're celebrating children, how we're embracing our Black children, especially our Black boys, and how are they being welcomed into the school environment. Next slide, please.
We will close out with Dr. Wood.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I'm trying to just get us back going here. Just one quick moment. So we can stop probably sharing the slides at this point so folks can be able to see us. So we want to thank you, everyone, for joining us. We're going to take this time to address a few questions so that we can be able to address any things that people are looking to hear more about. This is obviously a very deep conversation. There's a lot of context here. There's a lot of probably emotion tied up into some of the things that we've shared. And so what we'd like to do at this point is there was a question that came in around curriculum and what people are doing in higher education to help educate people around these issues. And there's so many people in this group who can respond to that. And so I'm going to actually ask 3 people to do so. I want Adara, Alma, and Keisha to do so on this first question, and then we'll go from there. We don't have a lot of time for questions, so our responses will be kind of quick and to the point, but we want to make sure that we can address some of the things you want to hear more about.
Okay, so the first question that we have is, what does anti-racism look like in higher education curriculum? And I could start off by answering that. I think for me as a faculty member at San Diego State University, I felt a level of responsibility once I would hear from the parents and also hearing from the students at our institution, and knowing that there were issues that were happening out in the community, and knowing that there was a level of responsibility that I had to take on because I was preparing people out in the field to work with children who look like my own. So what I did differently once I heard and I listened I took it upon myself to revamp my course. So I took it where now my course, I start off by talking about the overrepresentation of exclusionary discipline as it relates to Black children, the overrepresentation of special education as it relates to Black children, talking about performance levels. You know, obviously the performance levels are not as high because the children aren't in the classroom because they're being suspended or expelled, right? And then I move into the reasons of why we have Black authors, why all of our topics are on Black children and families, and then they understand, they get it. My students have been very receptive with the work that I've been doing as it relates to the research, but also as it relates to the conversations around Black children solely in my basic research class. So I think especially with what Keisha has mentioned about being brave, that is something that we have to take on to move forward. Otherwise, you know, these issues will still continue to occur. So I don't know if anyone else would want.
Yeah, let's go ahead and pass it over to Alma next.
Hi, everyone. So that was really, really inspiring to hear Dr. Eisen. I think earlier Keisha said, start with one slide and then add more. And so that's kind of a little bit of what I've been doing. So this last 2 weeks, I've been talking about infancy, or not even infancy, prenatal care. And I have challenged my students to read about the large amount of women in general that are experiencing maternal, the lack of maternal care in the delivery room, and the high rates of infant mortality among Black women and children. And so just challenging students to really think outside the box about this is a really important issue that has come up, and this is something that we should all be paying attention to. And those of you who aspire to be in the medical field, be very intentional in your practices and know the history of the medical field and what has been taught previously about pain threshold, and which is false. And so just kind of embedding those pieces throughout my course can be very shocking to many students, but is definitely important. And many of them have heard it before, but then just kind of keep scrolling through, so to speak. They hear it from other celebrities that have had children. And so kind of bringing that back and saying, remember this? And so those are just a little piece of what I do to challenge that piece. And then bringing in a lot of the information from the professors in this webinar when we talk about preschool and play and what that should look like and what it does end up looking like, unfortunately. Thank you.
Keisha?
I just was gonna say on top, I totally agree with everything that has been said. I will say to you that it's gonna look different. I believe that we are in the infancy of this conversation in higher ed. I think you're gonna experience where some of your instructors are all in, and everything they talk about is gonna be about some form of recognizing your bias, anti-racism, anti-Blackness, and all of it. And then maybe you'll get something from another person. But what I will say again is taking a look from the student perspective, keeping in mind that no matter the type of class you're in, you have a lot that you put into a classroom. It's a reciprocal relationship. No matter whether there's 100 students in the class or 5 students in the class. And I would say, ask questions, bring things up, let them know that you saw this webinar, send them the link to the webinar and say, do you know about Black Minds Matter? Have you heard about Peach? Let me share something with you. And so I know we have some other questions we want to get to, but that's where I would start. Thank you.
And just really quick, Michelle, if you wanted to add anything as I get ready to read the last question.
No, I'm good. I think my colleagues covered it.
Okay, so I know there's also questions around the video that was shown earlier. I was posted into the chat window, and when we send out the link to the final recording of this webinar, we'll make sure that that's embedded within it. In any other resources that we can offer, we'll also do that at this time. And then I think that the last question that we can take is, it says, what are some calls to action that educators and or administrators can do to support Black children in early education settings? And this, again, that's another situation where there's lots of folks who can respond to that, and want to see if any one of the panelists wants to just jump in.
I'll take that one. I shared earlier in the presentation that there are things that there are policy changes that need to take place, right? And then there's changes that need to take place on the ground floor, right? So I believe that, first of all, pre-teacher training, credentialing training, and ongoing in-service training needs to fundamentally change. Anti-racism and implicit bias trainings, anti-racism training isn't happening. Implicit bias training is happening, but needs to go further. It needs to be more thorough. In my research, I've seen that though preschool teachers are participating in implicit bias training, they're still not really understanding the definition of implicit bias and not understanding how we all bring our bias into the classroom. And we need to reflect on that. And then mentoring, right? We can have the trainings, we can teach anti-racism and anti-bias theoretically, but teachers need support in how to apply the theories to practice. And that goes along with the pre-teacher training, learning about this as a part of learning to be a teacher, understanding racism in general in our society, and understanding how racism in society shows up in school. And then we need to collect data on suspensions in preschool, not just K3, not just K12. This is showing up in all different areas of early childhood education, not just state funded or Head Start preschools, but there are many privately owned preschools who are not reporting this data. There are family childcare homes where many children spend the first years of their lives and being told to leave for, again, very developmentally appropriate behaviors. So administrators need to understand the importance of this. They need to understand that racial issues happen with very young children, and their teachers do not know how to respond to them.
That was a great summary. Latanga, did you want to provide something on that as well?
Yeah, and I would just add that as a leader, as an early ed leader, you have to be self-reflective. You got to think about, what do you want for your program and for your children that you serve? You know, you're leading an organization, and you've got to think about, you know, for many of us, when we got into the field of early ed, we got in to make a difference, right? So think about that. You've got in to make a difference. And we're always telling teachers, oh, your teachers are always learning. We have to really embrace that. As an early educator, we're always learning new things, and it is so okay to change. It's welcome to change. We can't continue to do things the same way, because we came into the profession to make a difference. And to make a difference, we've got to self-reflect on what we want in our vision for children and doing right by children, and especially our Black children and our Black boys. As a leader, you got to self-reflect.
Absolutely. And then I think we'll close out. There was a very specific question directed towards Mohammed about the experiences that you're seeing as it might relate to Black Muslim children. And if you could talk about that and any resources that you know that might be available for that.
Thank you, Dr. Wood. So some of the experiences that I've heard from various community members in San Diego and different cities throughout the nation our students is their hijabs being pulled off, their names being made fun of. You know, these kind of experiences definitely lead the child to hide their identity, which is counter to some of the goals that the school has. And oftentimes we find that schools aren't really equipped with the tools to be able to counter these instances of Islamophobia. Some of the resources that I would definitely, share would be to seek out local community members, local organizations that serve these very specific populations, and to partner with them to create ongoing training and ongoing professional development to everyone that encounters the student, not just the teachers, the faculty as well. I would highly encourage them to also make trainings for parents, because not everybody is going to be from the same background. So definitely exposing parents from that community to these different cultures and different identities.
Thank you, Mohammed. And thank you to all of the panelists from Peach and from the Black Minds Matter Coalition. This has been a labor of love. As you can tell, we're very passionate about these issues. This isn't something that we do as an intellectual exercise. This is our life. This is our communities, and these are the people that we care for. So we appreciate your attendance, and thank you so much for being here. There'll be a forthcoming email that kind of summarizes the event, provides video and other resources to you. We hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day, and that you use this as an opportunity to further advance Black minds and Black lives as we round out Black History Month. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.